A key theme of C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man is that there is a moral law that exists independent of human beings. That just as there are natural laws that exist independent of human beings, for example, the earth spinning at a certain speed, the earth tilting back and forth as the years go by, right? Just as there are natural laws that exist independently of human beings, so there is a moral law that exists independent of human beings. There's a moral law out there. There's a moral law that exists out there, right? Whether we are aware of it or not, although I think one of Lewis's ideas is that human beings can't help but to be aware of this moral law. But human beings do have the ability to ignore it. Human beings do have the ability to suppress it. St. Paul says the same thing in his letters, right, in the New Testament. Anyway, one of the key themes of Lewis's Abolition of Man is that there's a moral law that exists independently or independent from human beings. And from ancient times, different cultures have said that the human being's job, a primary task of the normally functioning human being, is to discover what this moral law is and then to align his or her life with it, right? Lewis refers to this moral law as the Tao, and here he's drawing on Chinese philosophy, right? Let's look at this quote. This thing which I have called for convenience the Tao, and which others may call natural law or traditional morality, is the sole source of all value judgments, or it's the sole source of all moral judgments, right? So as we go through life, we have to make moral judgments. What's right, what's wrong? Sometimes it's clear what's right and what's wrong, right? But how do we know? How do we know that? Sometimes some things just seem obviously right, sometimes things just seem obviously wrong. How do we know? I mean, and Lewis says that, well, we know this partly because we have a certain, normally functioning people have a certain moral intuition, right? And you just kind of feel that something is right. You just kind of feel that something is wrong, right? Now, of course, this will express itself differently in different cultures, and sometimes there will be a clash. Sometimes you'll have principles within the Tao that clash with one another. So, for example, compassion for strangers, well, certainly the Tao, as Lewis is calling it, certainly the Tao calls for compassion for strangers. But what if compassion for strangers conflicts with compassion for one's own family? What if it's not possible to do both? I mean, sometimes in life we have the wonderful opportunity to do both things. We can have compassion for strangers and compassion for the family. But sometimes there are situations where it's not possible to do both and we have to choose. And so there are conflicts within the Tao, right? But all moral judgments, Lewis says, are linked to what he's calling the Tao, this moral law that exists independent of human beings. Lewis goes on to ask the question, what happens in a society if a critical mass of people say that they don't believe this? That they are going to turn against what human beings pretty universally have believed from the beginning, so far as we know, that across cultures around the world, there is a general moral sense. A lot of cultural difference, but a general moral sense, right? That human beings are responsible to, accountable to, right? But what happens if you get a critical mass of people in a modern society who decide, no, we make up our own laws, right? We are a law unto ourselves. We're not accountable to any moral law external to ourselves. Well, this is one of Lewis's concerns, right? Just other examples of what Lewis is talking about when he refers to the Tao. That's a Chinese concept, but we have this verse from Hebrew scripture, the book of Ecclesiastes. God has set eternity in the human heart. The basic idea being that, of course, it would be ridiculous to say that everybody around the world should have detailed information about the Hebrew God Yahweh. That would be ridiculous to say that, Okay? And that's not what this verse is saying. What this passage in the Hebrew Scriptures seems to be implying is that there is something that all human beings share. And in this case, the word eternity is used. There is something that all human beings share, a sense of eternity in the human soul, a sense of eternity in the human heart. And the implication seems to be that human beings have the capacity to tap into that and to know what that is, right? Buddhists refer to the Dhamma, one translation of which can be perennial truth, the teaching of the Buddha, right? Perennial truth. And if you read a text called the Dhammapada, you'll notice a lot of similarities, although Buddhism, for example, and Christianity are very different. They call for very different ways of approaching the world, very different ways of thinking. There are a lot of moral similarities, a lot of cultural differences and a lot of practical differences, but a lot of moral similarities. And maybe this would be, going back to this verse in Ecclesiastes, because as different as human cultures are, there's one thing that they share, and that is a sense of eternity planted in the human heart. There's this ancient Hebrew idea. So one of the places, I'm sure, Lewis would agree, that people can go to learn about the Tao, Chinese, would be the Dhammapada, Buddhist scripture, which comes to us from, if I remember correctly, from India, right? Other sources we might look to, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Well, Aristotle's book in the Dhammapada and Hebrew, passages in the Hebrew scriptures, very, very different. But when it comes to certain basic moral dispositions, certain basic moral questions, we see similarities. We can see the same thing when we go to a Stoic philosopher named Seneca from the first century Roman Empire. This is Lewis's idea that there are a lot of similarities out there in basic moral teaching. Are there differences in cultures? Obviously. Are there differences in ways that, are there differences in behaviors that different religions call for? Certainly. But are there a striking number of moral similarities? Yeah. And Lewis refers to this as the Tao. Here we see moral teaching from an early Christian document. The Gospel of Matthew comes from the Sermon on the Mount. And here are certain moral precepts that are being offered. Blessed are the merciful, for example. Well, the Dhammapada would agree with that. The Stoic philosopher Seneca would agree with that, right? So Lewis would say, well, of course, this is a specifically Christian text, but it's tied into that sense of eternity in the human heart. It's linked to what we call the Tao, to the sense that there is a moral law that exists independent of human beings in the universe, and the human being's job is to figure out what that moral law is and then to align his or her life with it. From ancient Egypt, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, we have what are called the negative confessions, right? The idea is that when you die, you go through judgment. And as you go through judgment, you have to say, for example, I have not been a person of violence. I have not been a stirrer up of strife. I have not acted with undue haste. I have not pried my nose into matters. In other words, I haven't been nosy. I haven't dug into other people's business. Every one of those things fits with basic New Testament ethical teaching. Every one of those things fits with the basic ethical teaching of the Dhammapada. Every one of those things fits with the basic Stoic teaching of Seneca or Epictetus. Every one of those things fits with classical Confucian thought. This is Lewis's idea, that we can look at radically different cultures, and of course we have to notice the differences, and we have to notice that in some cases you do have conflict, right, about moral ideas, but that there does seem to be sort of foundational moral principles at work. And the goal of the human being is to tap into that, to learn about it, and to align his or her life with it. And if we do that, And if we pass that ability on to our children, then we're going to have a culture of moral depth. It doesn't mean we're going to have a culture of agreement, because again, sometimes moral goods will conflict, right? Sometimes there will be conflict. Sometimes you can have equally principled people who just see something different. Of course you're going to have that. That's how the world is, right? But even when there's conflict, a lot of times the people say, well, we have the same ultimate goal, we just disagree on how to get there. Right? You'll hear that kind of thing. If you have a culture in which a critical mass of people have a sense that there's a moral law external to us to which we are accountable, right? As in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Yeah, that when I die, my heart's going to be put on a scale. On the other side will be the requirements of this natural law, and I'm going to be weighed. My heart will be weighed in the balance, right? How did I do? That sense of accountability. The New Testament frequently speaks of judgment, and in every single case, judgment is for real, right? In every single case in the New Testament, judgment is for real. This idea, there's a moral law to which I'm accountable. If you have a critical mass of people who take that seriously and who act on it, then you're living in a culture of moral depth. But what happens if you live in a culture where people pay lip service to this kind of idea, but don't actually act according to it? They don't actually believe they're accountable to it. Or they just reject the idea altogether. And they say, I don't believe that. I don't believe there's a law external to human beings. We make our own laws. We are a law unto ourselves. What happens then? Well, this is a theme of Lewis's book, Abolition of Man. Lewis notes that our instincts are at war, right? That human beings are at war within themselves. They have contrary impulses. And this is why we need the Tao, because the Tao helps us to understand what we should do, right? I've got a quote here from Aristotle where he describes, in the human person, Aristotle says we have the irrational versus the rational. The irrational and the rational are at war with one another. St. Paul describes this in his letter to the Romans, chapter 7. He describes an internal war. Sigmund Freud, you read about his theory of mind. You've got the id versus the superego. Once again, an internal struggle. Julian of Norwich, this brilliant young woman from 4th century England, who writes about people have an animal will and they have a godly will, and these things are at war, right? I mean, look, we can observe this in our own lives, right? That human beings have these internal struggles. Well, what do we do? How do we know what to do, right? How do we know which direction to go? Well, Lewis's suggestion is this is why it's so important to dig into the precepts of the Tao, to learn the precepts of the Tao, to contemplate the precepts of the Tao. That gives us guidance. And people who have moved on further in life, they've learned more about how this works. They can help us to understand what we should do, right? But if our instincts are at war and we reject the idea of a Tao, we reject the idea of a law external to us, then what are we left with? According to Lewis's thinking, we're left with our instincts. And who's going to set the tone? Who's going to show the way? It's not the Tao. We've gotten rid of the Tao. We reject the idea of a Tao. So who's going to set up the parameters? Oh, it's going to be powerful people. The powerful people will set up the parameters. But these powerful people reject the idea of basic right and wrong. I hope you can see how that's a potentially dangerous place for a culture to be. Lewis writes that without the aid of trained emotions, the intellect is powerless against the animal organism. Right? Elsewhere in the book, Lewis talks about the mind, the belly, and the chest. The mind, that's the intellect, right? The belly, that's the impulse. That's the impulse. And it's the chest, or we can think of it maybe as the soul, right? That helps to guide the intellect. Not only, what do I think, but what's the right way to think? Or we have the impulses of the belly, the natural animal impulses that are common to us all. That sense of anger, that sense of rage, this impulse to do something, right? It's the chest, it's the soul, it's the things that's been shaped by the Tao that's able to take that energy and to shape it and to direct that energy into something that's useful, right? I guess in this sense, for those of us familiar with Freud's conception of mind, we could think of the chest as kind of like what Freud calls the ego. The ego is stuck between the superego, high ideals, and the id, which is nasty and beastly. And the id, the ego is trying to take that nasty energy of the id and to channel it into ways that kind of get at what the superego calls for, idealistic action, right? So maybe, it's different, but maybe what Lewis is getting at is a little bit like that. The chest, as he calls it, which ideally is shaped by the moral demands of the Tao, is able to take those animal impulses of the belly, as Lewis says, take that energy and channel it into something useful and productive. And the chest is also able to prevent the mind from making a god of itself, right? The human mind can do all sorts of things. I mean, look, we have examples in the 20th century of really, really, really smart people committing genocide, okay? Really, really, really smart people committing genocide. Highly intelligent, right? Empty. Highly intelligent, empty. We need a full chest, so to say, to go with Lewis's term. And what needs to fill that chest in order not to have the kind of example that we were just talking about, not either following beastly animal-like impulses or making a god of our own thoughts, making a god of our own minds, and causing a lot of destruction at the same time. What do we need? We need a full chest. And what is it that fills the chest? It's reflection on and obedience to the moral requirements of the Tao. And those who do that have better lives, right? Because they're more trustworthy, they're more honorable, they're more decent, right? Men without chests. That's what Lewis calls people who don't take seriously the idea of the Tao. And then Lewis says, remembering he himself a professor at Oxford University, right, a professor of English at Oxford University, it is an outrage that these people should be commonly spoken of as intellectuals. Yeah, these people who fill our universities with their fancy vocabulary, right, with their supposedly sophisticated ideas, right, so destructive, always tearing down, always criticizing, always promoting themselves, always enhancing their own status, right? Full, empty. Full, empty. A person who is highly intelligent but morally shriveled is a dangerous person. A person who is highly intelligent but morally shriveled or morally empty is a dangerous person. We can all see that a person who acts on the impulses of the belly, as Lewis says, we can all see that animal activity. Well, that's not good. We can all see that. That needs to be toned down. We can see that. That's dangerous. Yeah, but I think that also the highly intelligent person who is morally shallow, that person is also dangerous. So I guess I'm saying that I agree with what Lewis says in The Abolition of Man. Here's a quote from someone who people who read C.S. Lewis will also sometimes read G.K. Chesterton, another English writer. He says, there's something almost frivolous about the incapacity to think firmly and magnanimously or great-souledly, I'm using that word, about the first things. That is things like the Tao. What is justice? What is honor? What is decency? Right? These things of first primary importance. Chesterton says, there are a lot of people who are incapable of thinking about these kinds of things. Their souls are shriveled. They're incapable of thinking firmly about these things. They're incapable of thinking great-souledly about these things. What happens if these kinds of people get in charge of a government? Highly intelligent, but soulless in some sense? What happens to a university if you have a critical mass of professors who are highly intelligent but soulless? What happens to a popular culture if it's full of people who are highly intelligent but basically soulless? They lack the capacity to think firmly and magnanimously or great souledly about things of first importance, right? There's something empty about that, in addition to frivolous. How should we feel about a young man with cerebral palsy who nevertheless runs track? And he loses not only does he lose, he comes in last place every single race. And yet he persists in running because he loves it. How should we feel about that? How should we feel about a young man with cerebral palsy who runs marathons and who does not complete marathons in necessarily impressive times, right? But how should we feel about that? About a young man who rises to this challenge, who endures perhaps that sense, even before the race begins, I know what place I'm going to get. Maybe there's a sense of, almost relief in that, if you're competing to be number one or two, well, maybe there's some tension that if you go to the starting line knowing you're going to come in last place. I don't know. But there you are, everyone else is finished, and you're still going, coming in last as always. But how should the people in the audience, the people in the bleachers, how should they feel? There's just something that says that there's a moral law that says that I should think that's awesome. I should think that is so impressive. I should be moved by that. I should hold this up to young people and say, hey, you want to know what courage looks like? Here it is. You want to know what perseverance looks like? Here it is, right? Stop complaining about whatever thing you're complaining about, right? Look at this. This is impressive, right? How tragic would it be if someone is incapable of sensing that, of feeling that? Here's another example. How should we feel about a thug who for no reason at all first mocks and then punches a disabled man, a person with a significant physical disability? And this punk in the yellow sweatshirt there first mocks him and then for no reason punches him in the face. I have an intuition that I think is attached to the Tao. We should feel enraged. We should feel disgusted, right? And then the question becomes, well, what do we do with that rage, right? How do we channel that? Maybe that rage, in Lewis's terms, maybe that rage comes up from the belly. There's an animal desire to want to hit back, an animal desire to want to strike out. So that's a different moral question. What do we do with that? But I don't understand. It's impossible for me to believe that any morally functioning human being could see something like this and not feel profound disgust and anger, right? Well, where does that come from? I think that would come from the Tao, right? But how heartbreaking to think that there might be a whole class of young men who would not feel that way. That there might be a whole class of young men who might actually laugh if they saw this video. Even just contemplating that breaks my heart. I hope it's not true, but I fear it is. What happens if we have a growing population of people who are incapable of feeling deeply a sense of disgust that we should feel, a sense of rage that we should feel when we see something like this. That moral intuition that there is a right way to feel about this. There is a right way to feel about this. That, Lewis implies, is related to the Tao. And it applies in ancient Egypt, and it applies in first century Rome, and it applies in the 21st century United States, because the fundamentals of the Tao don't change. And it's always been in the human's interest to know what the Tao requires. Here's a beautiful passage from Isaiah chapter 40, which I won't read to you, but I encourage you to read it, Isaiah chapter 40, verses 28 through 31. It's beautiful. It's uplifting. It raises the spirit. Whatever else this is, it's really good literature, right? I just have a moral intuition. I have an intuition that the Tao says, yeah, this is something that should cause disgust. This is something that should raise the spirit, that should exalt the mind, right? How should we feel about an Olympic champion, Eric Liddell, who wins the 400 meters in the Olympics and then goes to China as a missionary? And then the Japanese invade China and he becomes a prisoner in a Japanese camp. And when he's a prisoner in the Japanese camp, he writes this book, The Disciplines of the Christian Life. And in this book, we read nothing about the suffering he experienced in that camp. We read nothing about his personal thoughts. We read nothing about his private life. I mean, one response for me was disappointment, because I was hoping for insights into his own thinking about his own life as an Olympic champion, now a prisoner in a Japanese camp. I was disappointed because there was none of that, and yet I couldn't help but be impressed by a person who wrote a book designed to encourage his fellow prisoners, right? How do we hold to our Christian lives here in prison? But interestingly, he never even mentions the prison. He never even mentions. If you read this, you would have no idea that he wrote this while in a Japanese prison camp, where he died. No idea, right? How do we promote the disciplines of the Christian life? That's what's important. Liddell says, talking about myself is not important. Sharing my own feelings is not important. Not right now, anyway. What's important is this work that I want to write. There is that sense of disappointment because I wanted to hear Liddell talk about his own life, and yet I couldn't help but admire a person who has that kind of fortitude, that kind of strength to say, I want to encourage others, and therefore I want to encourage them. I don't want to draw attention to myself. I want to encourage them to be disciplined in their Christian lives. That's what I want to point them to, so I don't want to point them to myself. Wow. That's impressive. That's admirable. I just have I have an intuition, a sense of moral intuition that the Tao says, the Tao requires me to say, yeah, that's impressive. As disappointing as it is, as a person who admires this guy, Eric Liddell, still I feel that there's something pulling me to say, yeah, it's really admirable though at the same time. It's really admirable. How should we feel about these 19, 20, 21, 22-year-olds who get out of their boats on June 6, 1944, carrying 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 pounds on their backs, as they jump into water up to their chest, as they jump into water up into their waist, as first they run through the water, then they run through the sand uphill, then they have to get up cliffs to defeat the Germans who have occupied Germany. And they're doing all of this as the machine gun fire comes down, as the artillery's coming down, as the mines are blasting. How should we feel about them? And why are they doing this anyway? Are they doing it to conquer and occupy another country, to make another country a colony? That's not why they're doing it. They're doing it to liberate people. They're doing it to liberate the people of France. They're doing it to liberate the people of Belgium and the Netherlands. I just have a sense that we should look at these young men with a sense of profound respect awe, that we should honor them? Where does this feeling come from? This sense that I have that the right response to these guys is respect and a sense of awe and a sense of honor. Lewis would say, well, that's the Tao. That's what the Tao is saying. That's what the Tao is saying. But what happens? This is Lewis's concern. What happens if we have a culture where fewer and fewer of those people who are in influential positions in schools, in universities, even in churches, in politics? What happens to a society if fewer and fewer people have a sense that there is a moral law that calls us to feel certain things about certain things, who calls us to feel certain things about things that happen in this world? There is a moral law to which we are accountable. What happens if a society loses its ability to feel a sense of awe? What happens if a society loses its ability to feel a sense of honor? What happens if a society loses its ability to have its spirits uplifted by something that is beautiful? What happens if a critical mass of people lose the capacity to feel moral outrage as something that is truly morally outrageous? What happens to a society if more and more of us lose the ability to feel deeply the sense of appreciation that we should have for someone who stands up to a challenge, who takes it on, who perseveres, and who gives the rest of us a wonderful model to follow? These are some of the questions that Lewis brings to us. The importance of the Tao, the recognition that there is a moral law external to us, to which we are accountable, and if we pay attention to it and if we act on it, this moral law will guide us and help us to lead better, more productive lives.